The Apache Wars were a series of conflicts between the Apache people and the United States Army, from the mid-1800s until 1886, fought across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico, sparked by broken treaties, forced relocations, and Apache resistance to confinement. The wars saw leaders like Mungus Coloradus, Cochise, Victorio, and Geronimo rise in defiance. But there is one name that many people don't know about, the last Bronco Apache to roam free. His name was Massai, and this is his story. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Massai was born in the 1850s in the Mescal Mountains, near present-day Globe, Arizona, to parents White Cloud and Little State, into the Nimbras Apache. His father believed toughness was the foundation of survival. Each day, young Massai was made to run up the rocky slopes of Mescal Mountain, first at short distances, about 100 yards, then eventually to the peak and back without stopping. By the time he was a teenager, he could cover ground like a deer and endure the harsh trials of the wilderness. His father, White Cloud, taught him the arts of war and the skills of a provider, how to fashion bows, string arrows, stalk rabbits, and take down deer. During these childhood years, he befriended a Tonkawa boy named Gray Lizard. Together, they became inseparable, hunting, chasing wild horses, even building log corrals to break them. It was a childhood forged in brotherhood in the wildness of the Arizona high desert, preparing Massai for the storm that would come. Most of the story of Massai comes from his daughter, Alberta Begay, who told the story of her father to Eve Ball, who wrote a book called Inda, an Apache Odyssey. This is where we get the majority of the information in the story we know of Massai. By the mid-1870s, the Chiricahua Apache were under relentless pressure. After the deaths of Cochise, 1874, and Mungus Coloradus, executed 1863, this caused the leadership to be fractured. In 1876-77, government policy forced the Warm Springs and Chiricahuas onto the harsh San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, known as Hell's 40 Acres. The land was barren, the climate unforgiving, and rations were poor. Disease and hunger were constant companions. It was in this climate that Geronimo, a leader from the Badonkohe band of the Chiricahua, rose as a figure of defiance. In 1877-78, he was briefly imprisoned at San Carlos, but broke away, taking men, women, and children south into Mexico's Sierra Madre. By 1879-1880, as Victorio, a prominent chief of the Warm Springs band of the Central Apaches, waged his desperate war across New Mexico and Texas, Geronimo was also stirring resistance, seeking to unite scattered Apache groups. According to Alberta Begay's account, sometime around the late 1870s, Geronimo called a great council in the mountains, likely near the Warm Springs homeland in the Black Range of New Mexico. Massai, then in his 20s and already hardened by his father's training at Mescal Mountain, attended alongside Gray Lizard. Roughly 1,000 Apaches gathered on the slopes to hear Geronimo's words. Carrying a white flag as a symbol of parley, Geronimo stood before them and spoke with fire. He told the people that Usen, the creator, had placed the Apaches on this land before the coming of the whites, and that no one had the right to take it away. He urged them to prepare not just for skirmishes, but for the long struggle, perhaps 2 years or more. The warriors were to hunt and stockpile meat, drying strips of venison and buffalo in caves. The women were tasked with gathering mezcal, piñon nuts, cactus fruit, berries, and medicinal herbs, preserving and storing them. Massai and Gray Lizard embraced the call. They traveled westward as far as Southern California, killing deer, tanning hides, and caching food in mountain caves. They worked in shifts, one standing guard at a lookout point, the other butchering and drying the meat. In one cave they left an enormous supply, wrapped in a buffalo hide, hidden on a high ledge. Massai told Gray Lizard, "You remember this place, and if you get hungry and need food, you come back here, and I will do that too." They returned back toward Mescal Mountain, where Geronimo and the Chiricahuas were gathering. For a few days they lingered there, preparing to hide their supplies, unaware that fate had already struck. When at last they started toward Warm Springs to rejoin Geronimo's army, they were the last to arrive. But instead of finding warriors and families, they found silence. The camp had been seized in their absence. Jean Clum and his Indian police had pounced and captured Geronimo, leading him away under guard. Not knowing, Massai and Grey Lizard kept on their trail, thinking all was well. As night fell, they spotted the glow of a fire ahead and their hearts lifted, certain that they had found their people again. As they strode into camp, soldiers seized the two hunters and forced them toward San Carlos. Their preparations had been in vain. Instead of fighting as they had been promised, they were dragged to the reservation. At San Carlos, Massai's life shifted. He married a Chiricahua woman, and they had 2 children. Massai seldom spoke of his years at San Carlos, keeping these memories locked away, though whispers remained. He had once ridden with Geronimo, fought beside him when the band was small and desperate. His courage remembered by men like Eugene Chihuahua and Jasper Cansey. Yet when Geronimo broke free at Turkey Creek, Massai did not follow. He turned instead to his wife and children, choosing the quiet defiance of family over the endless flight of war. James K. Wakela recalled how Massai sought solitude, taking his loved ones back toward San Carlos, shunning the company of Geronimo's warriors. The authorities, confused by his movements, suspected rebellion, unable to grasp that he only wanted peace. Like many Apaches balancing survival and dignity, he enlisted as a scout for the U.S. Army. In 1880, he rode in campaigns against Victorio, the Warm Springs chief who had refused confinement and fought across New Mexico and Texas until his death in October of that year. 2 years later, in 1882, Massai was aboard a train bound for Arizona with other scouts when he learned that Loco's band had been forced off San Carlos and driven into Mexico. Massai leaped from the train, made his way into the Sierra Madre, and rejoined Geronimo briefly. But he found the outlaw life unstable and mistrusted Geronimo's leadership. Within weeks, he had stolen Jason Betson as his horse and slipped back to San Carlos with his family. 3 years later, in May 1885, Geronimo led another dramatic breakout, taking several hundred men, women, and children south into Mexico. Massai initially went with them, but soon grew wary of the constant flight. Unlike Geronimo, he had little taste for the endless raiding and retreat. He voluntarily returned to Fort Apache. Rather than punish him, the army allowed him to rejoin his family, recognizing his previous service as a scout. The same year, Massai was among the scouts sent into Mexico under Captain Emmett Crawford to pursue Geronimo. In January 1886, Mexican irregulars mistook the American scouts for raiders and opened fire, killing Crawford in the chaotic battle. Massai, along with other scouts, which included the young Apache Kid, witnessed the debacle. The campaign exposed the fragile loyalty demanded of Apache scouts. They were asked to hunt their own kin, under officers who could not even protect them from their supposed allies. By the late summer of 1886, the Apache Wars were effectively over. After nearly a decade of breakouts and raids, Geronimo had surrendered for the final time to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon on the 4th of September, 1886. The government's solution was brutal and sweeping. Every Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apache member, warriors, women, children, even the scouts who had faithfully served the army, would be deported as prisoners of war to Florida. No distinction was made between loyalists and renegade. At Fort Apache in San Carlos, families gathered what few belongings they could carry. Massai, his Chiricahua wife, and their 2 small children were loaded alongside Geronimo's people, Chief Naiche and the Warm Springs bands. Alberta later recalled that Grey Lizard stayed close by, still bound to her father by friendship. The first trains carried Geronimo's immediate followers east through El Paso and San Antonio, but Massai's group was escorted north, herded into prison cars of the Atkinson, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. They passed through Winslow, Albuquerque, Lamy, and Raton, and then were transferred on another line in Kansas for the long haul across Missouri. For many of the Apaches, it was their first ride on such a machine, a terrifying rattle of steel and smoke carrying them into exile. A young joker broke the grim silence. Spotting 2 prisoners with red handkerchiefs tied around their heads, he smirked and said, The captains say that the ones that have the red handkerchiefs are going to be hanged when they get to Florida. His words planted a seed in the minds of Grey Lizard and Massai. The two had nothing, no weapons, no tools, but they quietly saved scraps of food and began to plan. Massai confided in his wife, who urged him to take the chance. He promised her he'd try, telling her to go on to Florida, and if fate allowed, he would find her again. A while later, as the train crawled uphill through Missouri, the moment came. The guards stepped away, and with one swift move, they opened a window, leaped into the night, and tumbled down the embankment. Hidden in the brush, they watched the train disappear over the rise. Perhaps the guards thought him dead, but word of the escape spread, and soldiers would hunt Massai for years. Their ordeal was just getting started. The two men were stranded deep in Missouri, surrounded by towns, farms, and soldiers. They knew nothing of the land or its people, but Apache endurance would carry them. They had very little in terms of supplies, just their breechcloths, moccasins, and fire sticks. No Apache was without those in his belt. They traveled only at night, hiding by day in brush or ditches. Hunger gnawed at them. They would throw rocks and kill quail and rabbits, roasting them on tiny fires barely larger than a candle flame. At times they would slip into mining camps. At one, they crept down after the workers had gone into the shaft, snatching bread, coffee, and meat from the coals. They found rifles and ammunition in a lean-to, seized them, and cut a half-hanging sheep carcass from a tree for food. Each theft was a gamble. If discovered, they would be hunted down by miners and soldiers alike. As they moved westward, the land grew more arid. They fashioned a water bag from the stomach of a deer they had killed. But one night, Grey Lizard stumbled against a cactus and tore it open. Their precious stores spilt into the sand. By the next day, their lips cracked, their throats burned, and death pressed close. Alberta remembered her father's words. He prayed as White Cloud had taught him, calling to Houston for aid. And then, as if in answer, the skies opened. Rain poured down the canyons, filling hollows. The two men dug a pit to catch the water, drank deeply, and filled themselves with new strength. In the fall of 1887, Massai and Grey Lizard finally drew near the mountains of their youth. From where they stood, the White Mountain rose into sight, and not far beyond lay Mescal Mountain. The two men, wary but relieved, carried their guns and ammunition into a hidden spot where they rested a full day, safe enough at last to sleep deeply. When their strength returned, they crossed over the White Mountain and passed westward, the land familiar and alive with memories. At last, Massai told his companions, "This is the White Mountain, and the Mescaleros live here. We will stay here, and we will stay here a while." But Grey Lizard's heart pulled him back towards Mescal Mountain, where his family lived. On a saddle ridge near Three Rivers, they parted ways. Massai pointed to the far end of the San Andreas and gave directions. Grey Lizard left, and Massai watched him disappear, never to see him again. No one in those parts claimed to have laid eyes on Grey Lizard after that day. Alone now, Massai climbed high into the White Mountain. There, he sat for days, heavy with the thought that he might never again see his wife or children. As Massai sat atop White Mountain, he began to hear a voice in the wind of women speaking Apache. He followed cautiously and came upon a canyon where three Mescalero girls were gathering pinyon nuts. Among them was a 17-year-old girl named Zanagoliche. Zanagoliche's life was complicated before Massai appeared. She had been married young to Jabato, a Lipan Apache man who had once allied with Comanches. By the mid-1880s, he was restless, talking of moving east to join the Comanche Reservation in Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. But Zanagoliche did not want to leave her family at Mescalero. She had two small boys, and her heart was torn between them and the only homeland she had ever known. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some Mescaleros, like her sister Catherine Kojo, said Massai suddenly appears, seized Zanagoliche, and pulled her away while others tried to follow his tracks, but quickly lost the trail. Alberta, years later, insisted the story was more complicated. Her father treated Zanagoliche kindly on the trail, and though he had taken her from her family, he gave her a choice, return or stay. She chose Massai. The two moved west together, and somewhere between Mescalero and Arizona, They celebrated their union Apache style with a simple wedding feast. Zanagoliche agreed to be his wife, and from that moment, the two began their life in hiding. They settled near Mescal Mountain, where Masai had been born, but ranged widely between the Sierra Blanca, the San Andreas, and even to California. They lived as their ancestors had, hunting deer and rabbits, gathering mezcal and piñon, and building shelters of brush and hide. To the outside world, Masai was a renegade, a Bronco Apache. To his family, he was a provider. Over the years, they had 6 children: Herbert, Cora, Edith, Mary, Alberta, and Clifford. Life was precarious but full. Alberta later recalled her father's skill with horses and his tenderness with the children, carrying them on hunts and teaching them to run the mountain trails as his father White Cloud had once trained him. One of the most dramatic episodes of these years came when they encountered a wounded Mexican man named Santos. His leg was shattered below the knee, and he was near death. Many would have left him to die in the wilderness, but Masai carried him to safety. Using roots he had learned of in childhood, Masai bound and treated the leg, singing and praying as he set the bone. Within days, the wound began to heal. Santos lived with the family for a time, helping Zanagoliche with camp chores, carrying water, and tending the children when Masai hunted. Alberta remembered him as a kindly presence. Unfortunately, he eventually succumbed to pneumonia and was buried with Apache and Catholic rites, a simple wooden cross marking his grave. While Masai raised his family, his name was whispered in every agency report. From 1887 to 1890, officials at San Carlos and Fort Apache blamed him for raids, killings, and abductions. Sometimes the crimes were real, but evidence was almost non-existent. Often he was confused with the Apache Kid, another scout turned fugitive. Both men were about the same age, both knew the terrain intimately, and both were skilled horsemen. White settlers, desperate for someone to blame when livestock disappeared or homesteads were attacked, simply invoked the name Masai. Alberta bristled at these accusations. Her father, she said, killed only in defense, when cornered, when his family was threatened. He did not abduct women, nor murder wantonly. But the myth of Masai the Raider grew. Newspapers called him a ghost, a specter who slipped across New Mexico and Arizona. For more than a decade, Masai and Zanagoliche lived on the margins, never fully free, never fully captive. They taught their children to travel light, to vanish into the brush at the sound of hoofbeats. Nights were filled with campfire songs, mornings with the smell of roasting mezcal. They endured the winters in the shelter of canyons, summers in the high country, moving like shadows across the ranges. To the army, he was a renegade, the last of the untamed Broncos. To his children, he was their father. To Zanagoliche, he was her husband. Their life together was a fragile balance between love, family, and the constant threat of discovery. But by the turn of the century, Masai's years of moving unseen through the mountains were drawing to a close. He was near 40 or 50. He had raised a family with Zanagoliche in the high country. He had survived raids, betrayals, starvation, and endless pursuit. But in his later years, he grew uneasy. Alberta recalled her father's words to her mother. He stated, "Well, it has been a long time since I took you from Mescalero, and now I know we have all these children. I want them to be safe. I want you to take them back to Mescalero. I don't want to have any more children because I am afraid that before I die, something will happen." This decision sealed his fate. Leaving the familiar shelter of Mescal Mountain, the family started east towards San Marcial Mountain, aiming to cross the Rio Grande and return to the Mescalero reservation. Zanagoliche prepared the family for the journey with only 2 bay horses, gathering the children close while Masai walked beside them with his gun. From Mescal Mountain they traveled east towards San Marcial, reaching its base after 3 hard days. They camped on the flats that night, but at first light, mounted again, hurrying toward the mountain's safety, for anyone caught out on the open plain risked being shot by the white men. At the river that ran down from the heights, they watered their horses and filled their water bags. Then Masai told the family to climb a little hill and wait while he kept watch. Far to the west he saw dust rising, and he knew men were trailing them hard. Hiding behind a cedar with his .30-30 Winchester, he fired, striking down one rider. The second man, panicked and unsure where the shot had come from, put his brother's body onto the horse and fled back to San Marcial. Zanagoliche, who had been watching from behind, heard the crack of the rifle, and was now furious. "Why did you kill that man? Now they will all come for us," she stated. But Masai knew there was no choice. The pursuers had been too close. He urged his family toward the mountains, into a canyon where they might find safety. That night, a posse formed. Some accounts tell of ranchers and settlers from Chloride and the San Marcial area who were involved. Men like Charlie Anderson, John and Ed James, Walter Hearn, and Bill Keeney. Others describe military scouts and police laying in ambush. Whoever they were, they followed the tracks into the foothills, determined to end the threat of the Last Bronco Apache once and for all. At dawn, as Masai and his eldest son Herbert went to fetch the hobbled horses, shots rang out from the brush. Alberta, only a small child, remembered seeing her father fall. Herbert leapt over a bluff, miraculously escaping the bullets. Zanagoliche grabbed a blanket and some food, gathered the children, and fled into the hills. From their hiding place, the family watched. The posse built a massive fire, far too large for cooking. Alberta recalled, "We watched. They throw him on top of that fire. We were afraid to go down. They might be hiding to kill us." For 3 days they stayed in the mountains, the smoke rising like a signal of death. At last, when the fire burned low, Zanagoliche crept to the ashes. She raked with her hands until she found something solid, the scorched buckle from Masai's cartridge belt. She held it in her hands, weeping, and stated, "All the time you took care of me and the children. Now you nothing but ashes. I will keep this buckle. It is all I have to take back to the children." The circumstances of Masai's death remain clouded in conflicting reports. His daughter Alberta gave the most direct account, recalling as a child of her father's death, which is the one you just heard. Yet frontier sources tell different stories. In 1906, rancher Charlie Anderson, who led the posse near Chloride, claimed to have killed the Apache Kid after a raid, though some later admitted they weren't certain. But modern historians do suspect the victim could have been Masai. Another version from 1907 placed the Kid's death near Hot Springs, where the James brothers, Ed and John, claimed to have cut off his head and sent it to Yale's Skull and Bones Society. Newspapers even reported as late as 1911 that Masai, the Last Bronco Apache, had finally been gunned down. These contradictions show how Masai and the Kid became interchangeable in settler imagination, blamed for raids, hunted in rumor, and killed multiple times over. But the strongest evidence remains Alberta's testimony, that her father died near San Marcial around 1906, his memory surviving only in family stories and a burnt belt buckle. Zanagoliche gathered her children and began the heartbreaking journey back to Mescalero. They crossed the Rio Grande near San Marcial, stealing a horse when theirs gave out, cooking a calf in desperation to feed the children, and finally climbing the slopes of Sierra Blanca to her family's camp. At first, they were not recognized. Their buckskin clothes marked them as wild. But once they began speaking, her family recognized her and they had an emotional reunion. Masai's legacy endures as one of the most haunting of the Apache Wars, a man who refused to be broken by confinement, betrayal, or exile. Remembered as the last of the Bronco Apaches, he symbolized the stubborn endurance of people determined to live free, even when freedom meant hunger, pursuit, and constant danger. To settlers and soldiers, he was a phantom rider, blamed for every theft and killing across southern New Mexico. To his family, he was a provider, a protector, a man who prayed for rain in the desert, who healed the wounded, and who raised children in the old Apache ways while hiding from the world. Even in death, his story is blurred with that of the Apache Kid, a confusion that only deepened his myth. Yet, through Alberta's voice and the charred buckle she preserved, Masai's true legacy survives. Not as a ruthless outlaw, but as the last free Apache, a father who fought only when cornered, and a symbol of resistance against a world determined to erase him. Before I end this episode, Masai's name survives in popular culture. The movie Apache in 1954 by Burt Lancaster brought widespread attention to the warrior. If you're interested, you can find the movie on YouTube. Talk about a classic. There are also two geological features that are named after Massai, Massai Plateau and Massai Point, located in the heart of Apache country. I hope you all enjoyed this episode on Massai, the last Bronco Apache. If you did, please give a thumbs up and maybe subscribe if you feel so inclined. Also, thank you to William from the Chiricahua Apache, who was a great help with this episode. I really appreciate it. If you want to chat more about Massai or history in general, email me, wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. Tell your friends about Wild West Deep Dives. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.